over 50 years, video games have evolved in many ways, from the first consoles to arcade machines and later VR and computer gaming. We have had many great games, from table tennis to racing to shooting and platformers, just to name a few of many game genres. In this video we will be going over the many consoles and video games we had, as well as talking about the foundation behind the first video games and the consoles that have ever been made until now. The history of video games can date all the way back to the 1950s, when the first video games were used as electronic lab equipment, such as tic-tac-toe or tennis for two. The tennis game, for example, was created on a large analog computer with a connected oscilloscope screen for the annual Visitors' Day at the Brookhaven National Library in Upton, New York. In 1962, Steve Russell at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology invented the game Space War, a computer-based space combat video game for the PDP-1 or Program Data Processor 1, a cutting-edge computer that was mostly found in universities. This was the first video game that could be played on multiple computer installations. The game served as a foundation for the future of the video game industry and is considered the first digital video game. You can tell this game is really groundbreaking, especially knowing it was possible to play on screens back then before home use. A few years later, in 1966, Ralph Baer came up with an idea he had, which was a concept of using a television to play games. He was the head of equipment design at Sanders Associates, a military contractor, and the company led developers with a proposal for a prototype multiplayer. Multi-program video game system for a television that was known as the Brown Box. Ralph Baer would demonstrate this system to several companies who all were enthusiastic about the device. Only RCA wanted to purchase this device, but an agreement could not be reached. RCA executive Bill Elders would later leave RCA for Magnavox and would convince Magnavox to look at the console again. The Brown Box was pitched to Magnavox, and they agreed to produce the console. An agreement was signed in 1971, and Magnavox would license and sell this console as the Odyssey. And this is where we go over the first video game console ever, the Magnavox Odyssey. The Magnavox Odyssey came out in 1972 and would go on to have over 28 games. This video will be going over just the most important ones. The console had a cable that connected to a box that had a coaxial plug in on the TV set.
Look at this thing. Looks like a spaceship. What's the top for? The controllers are even stranger. You get a reset button and two knobs on the sides, one to move vertical and one to move horizontal, and then one more to do God knows what. But tell me, how are you supposed to hold these things? Or do you just put them on a table? The wires are bulky and not flexible at all. They're short too. If you're sitting on your couch, the wires don't reach. However, the wire that connects the console to the TV is long as shit. Alright, I guess you're supposed to play with it on your lap or on the floor.
Now this very first video game console came with 2 controllers, 6 game cards, and is powered by 6 C batteries. Alright, let's fire this baby up. Batteries here, controller there, and now we connect the video cable from the console over to the, wait a minute.
Now, many of the games have overlays on the TV, and they would play board games around your TV screen. One of the many games include table tennis, where you play with another person, and you play until one doesn't reach the ball.
We'll start off with the flagship game of the Odyssey called Tabletop Tennis. Just like in real tennis, the goal here is to keep hitting the ball back and forth until you knock it off the opponent's side of the screen. To bring the ball back into play, the loser must press the reset button on top of his controller. Now, trying to get a feel for this game can take some time, since on the controller, the dial on the left moves you back and forth, and the one on the right moves you up and down, and this little one puts spin on the ball. Now your regular tennis game can now be played on a green tennis court. Oh cool! Even though it is the same game. Oh.
Instruction manual is absolutely imperative because without it, you wouldn't know the right combination, which game and which overlay. Let's try some tennis. You just stick this son of a bitch on the screen here and you're all set.
This was inspiration for Pong, which would later be an arcade and a video game by Atari as well. The cartridges would be numbered so you wouldn't know what to play until you play the game yourself.
The main overall game is actually built inside the Odyssey itself. Then each card placed into the machine creates its own set of command codes that alters the game in its own unique way. And one of the nice things about the Odyssey is that it only turns on when you place one of these cards in the slot.
Other notable games include Simon Says.
Switching over to a new overlay brings us to a game called Simon Says, and it works with these flashcards. Alright Hal, Simon Says, foot. Alright, now Simon Says, nose. Alright, now Simon Says, penis? Alright, now Simon Says... What the hell's up with these cards? Now Simon Says... Oh, forget it.
A states guessing game.
States. Okay, this one's just a name that state game. If you draw a card, you move the cursor on the state. But what about the little states? How are you supposed to point at them? I guess you could just point with your finger. This doesn't need to be a video game in any way. I also love how the instructions tells you that Alaska and Hawaii aren't really down there. Hey nerdy turd, did you know that Hawaii isn't really south of Texas?
Football, baseball, hockey, and skiing. In 1977, Atari released the Atari 2600, or the video computer system, a home console that featured joysticks and interchangeable game cartridges that played multicolored games, effectively kicking off the second generation of the video game consoles. Many of the games, most notably some of the arcade games, would be released on the Atari 2600. These games include Pac-Man, Miss Pac-Man, Mario Bros., which was licensed from the arcade game before Nintendo got their own console, and many sports games and board games such as the Indianapolis 500 or Indy 500 and Tic-Tac-Toe, for example. The second generation of video games would start with the Atari 2600 and also the Mattel Intellivision in 1979. The Intellivision had a keypad for a controller, which was like a phone, and even introduced voices in video games, such as in the games B-17 Bomber and Bomb Squad.
Mattel Electronics presents B-17 Bomber. Mattel Electronics presents Bomb Squad.
There were other games like Q*bert, Frogger, as well as Star Wars: The Empire Strikes Back, based on the movie. The video game industry during this time had many notable milestones in the late 1970s and early 1980s, such as Nintendo's creation of Donkey Kong, which introduced the world to Mario as Jumpman, and would lead up to the main Mario Bros. Arcade game. There was also Microsoft's release of its first flight simulator game, the introduction of the United States to the arcade game Pac-Man, the release of the Space Invaders arcade game in 1978, and the launch of Activision in 1979, which was a third-party developer that developed video game software without making consoles or arcade cabinets. Activision, for example, would develop video games since the Atari era, and they still do video games even in the modern day in the past 2 decades, for example. A notable console that came out in the early 1980s, which was 1982 and 1983 to be exact, would be the Vectrex. What was really unique about this console was that it didn't need to be hooked up to a TV, as it had its own monitor like an arcade cabinet. This console is considered a mini arcade and can play games such as Mindstorm, which is similar to Atari's Asteroids. But 1983 was when things first took a turn for the worst in video game history, and that was the video game crash. This crash happened due to a number of factors, such as an oversaturated gaming console market, which included Atari's then newer console, the Atari 5200, a console that re-released many Atari 2600 games and had bad accessories, competition from early computer gaming such as the Commodore, and a surplus of overhyped low-quality games such as the E.T. for the Atari 2600 video game based on the movie, and considered the worst video game ever created of all time. The E.T. game, for example, needed more copies and could only be completed in 6 months, which was a large demand that exceeded the normal amount of copies that could be made during that time. A lot of people didn't like the game and were very disappointed about how the game turned out, which is why many copies were buried in the New Mexico desert. This crash led to the bankruptcy of several home computer and video game console companies during the mid-1980s. The video game industry would begin to recover from the video game crash in 1985 when Nintendo released the Nintendo Entertainment System, or the Famicom in Japan, which the Nintendo Entertainment System, or NES, released in the United States as that name. The NES had improved 8-bit graphics, colors, sound, and gameplay over previous consoles that came before. The games that came bundled with the NES were Super Mario Bros. And Duck Hunt. Super Mario is a very challenging game where you could collect coins, jump on enemies, and keep advancing until you get to the end, which was a real game changer for the new Mario franchise. Duck Hunt, unlike Mario, would use a zapper to shoot ducks, and usually is not re-released because shooting doesn't work well on modern flat-screen TVs nowadays, or LCDs, even when you can play the games. Other games include boxing game Punch-Out!, The Legend of Zelda, Metroid, Castlevania, Mega Man, and Final Fantasy, including console versions of Donkey Kong and Pac-Man. Many of these game releases were better than the Atari games, as Nintendo imposed various regulations on third-party games developed for its system, helping to combat rushed, low-quality software. In 1989, Nintendo released their first major handheld video game console. Before this, they had the Game & Watch handheld console, but this one really took off. This console was the Game Boy, which came with the game Tetris. The Game Boy wasn't in color, and despite poor quality with not too bad gameplay, the Game Boy was a huge success. There were many great spin-offs of NES games and third-party games for Game Boy, such as Mario games, and other games like Kirby. But the biggest game that ever got released on the Game Boy, at least in the 90s, was Pokemon, specifically Pokemon Red and Blue, which was one of the best-selling games on the Game Boy, and this even led to a color Game Boy, the Game Boy Color being released in 1998. If you want to know more about Pokemon as a video game, other than the TV show, I have a link to a video I made about that in the description. Also, in 1989, Sega would make a debut in the video game console market by releasing the Sega Genesis as a successor to the Sega Master System. At first, they failed to compete against the Nintendo Entertainment System with the Master System. However, the Genesis would make a leap against the NES, with 16-bit graphics compared to the NES, and games such as Sonic the Hedgehog, including a clever marketing campaign. In 1991, Nintendo released its answer to the Genesis, which was their own 16-bit console, the Super Nintendo. The first real console war had just begun. The early to mid-1990s saw releases of popular games on Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis, such as Super Mario World on the Super Nintendo, with the introduction of Yoshi, and franchises such as Street Fighter II on the Super Nintendo, the sequel to the arcade game, and Mortal Kombat, which was a fighting game that had blood and gore, like real fighting in the Genesis version of the game. Violent video games such as Mortal Kombat and Doom were considered very controversial because of how violent video games like that were. In response to this, Sega created the Video Game Rating Console in 1993 to provide descriptive labeling for every game sold on a Sega console. This helped make way for the ESRB, or the Entertainment Software Rating Board, which rates video games based on what demographics are appropriate to play the game. During the 1990s, video games made their way into movies with the Super Mario Bros. Live-action movie in 1993, which was a huge flop at the box office when it came to a movie about the Mario Bros. Over the next 2 years, there were movies of Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat over the next 2 years. Numerous other movies have been released about video games since, the most notable being the Tomb Raider series of video game movies. The next generation of video games in the mid-90s came forth with the leap in computer technology. Three-dimensional or 3D gaming was on the rise. Sega released the Sega Saturn, which was the first 32-bit console that played CDs for video games instead of cartridges over 5 months ahead of schedule. Sega did this to compete with Sony's development of their first video game console, which was the PlayStation. Sony originally wanted to make a CD version of the Super Nintendo or Super Famicom console, but after it was announced in 1991, Nintendo broke the partnership and decided to work with Philips instead, and Sony instead made the PlayStation its own console. Nintendo would be staying with cartridges with Nintendo 64, a 64-bit system. Although Sega and Nintendo have each released their fair share of successful 3D titles, such as Virtua Fighter on the Sega Saturn, including Super Mario 64 and GoldenEye on Nintendo 64, for example, those consoles could not compete with Sony's strong third-party support on the PlayStation, which helped them secure exclusive titles such as Metal Gear Solid, Tomb Raider, Resident Evil, and Final Fantasy, other than many other games, such as Parappa the Rapper, for example. Sony ended up becoming the biggest video game company with PlayStation over Nintendo, Sega, Atari, and later on Microsoft, with the PlayStation 2 becoming the best-selling video game console of that generation of gaming, topping the Xbox, Dreamcast, and GameCube. And other than having DVD capability, since the PlayStation 2 was the first console to have a DVD drive before the Xbox, the PlayStation 2 is backwards compatible with the PlayStation 1. The Dreamcast, which was considered by many to be ahead of its time and one of the greatest consoles ever made for several reasons, including its capability for online gaming, ended up being a commercial flop that ended Sega's console efforts. Despite having games like Sonic Adventure, Sonic Shuffle, and Seaman, Sega pulled the plug on the system in 2001, becoming a third-party software company after that. Other than that, Atari also became a third-party maker of older-themed flashback consoles for classic games from the older consoles after the Jaguar in the mid-1990s. In 2005 and 2006, Microsoft's Xbox 360, Sony's PlayStation 3, and Nintendo's Wii kicked off the modern age of high-definition gaming. Though with the PlayStation 3 being the only system at the time to play Blu-rays becoming successful in its own right, Sony, for the first time, faced stiff competition from its rivals. The Nintendo Wii had composite for HD other than SD AV plugs, and the Xbox 360 also had HDMI, just like the PlayStation 3. However, they just had DVD and HD DVD plugs, and the Xbox 360 also had HDMI, just like the PlayStation 3. HD DVD did not last very long and was a flop compared to Blu-ray, which had better HD quality on a disc. The Xbox 360 introduced the Kinect, which was a motion capture system that offered a different way to play video games using a sensor and a camera. They even won more awards than the other platforms. However, the Nintendo Wii was the most successful in this stiff competition because they became the most successful when it comes to units sold in their gaming generation, right behind the PlayStation 2 from the previous generation, other than many successful games with the new motion-sensitive controls that, despite being a new step in the traditional gaming, it helped appeal to a wider demographic of family and elderly people. For example, the Nintendo Wii also had many games like Wii Sports and Wii Play, which made the controls more fitting for sports and activity games, and it gave new meaning to Mario Kart for Mario Kart Wii and other Mario games such as New Super Mario Bros., as well as third-party games with Nunchuk and other controller accessories. Towards the end of the 2000s and the beginning of the 2010s, video games were spread to mobile devices such as iPhones, for example, helping to reach a more casual gaming audience, including in portable gaming. Rovio, the company behind Angry Birds, for example, made $200 million in 2012 alone off of Angry Birds. In 2011, Skylanders Spyro's Adventure helped bring video games into the physical world. This was the first series of video games based on the character to do so. You would place toy figures onto something that glows, which plugs into your console, and you would play as the toy you set, and it will go onto the game when you place the toy onto there. I had this game before for the PlayStation 3, and I played a lot of this game, and while it was unique, it was very challenging. I spent a lot of time playing this game, and I got it. The next few years would see several sequels and other toy video game hybrids, such as Disney Infinity, which features Disney characters such as Mickey Mouse, and Pixar characters from movies such as Toy Story and The Incredibles. The 8th generation of video games would begin in 2012 and 2013 with the release of the Wii U in 2012, followed by the PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One being released in 2013. The Xbox One was called by that name because the console would have everything all in one, such as TV streaming and video games, as well as other accessories and features. Despite the Wii U featuring a touchscreen remote and a remote control gamepad that allowed off-TV gaming and being able to play Wii games, the fact you couldn't play too far from the console, the Wii U was a commercial failure compared to its competition. It was discontinued in 2017. Simply put, the Wii U didn't become as successful as its predecessor, the Nintendo Wii. There were some games that were successful that got sequels on the Nintendo Switch, such as Super Mario Maker and Splatoon. Speaking of the Nintendo Switch, that's where we fast forward to the same year the Wii U was discontinued, which was 2017, where Nintendo released the Nintendo Switch, originally the Nintendo NX in development. The Switch was the only system to allow television and handheld gaming, with the console being placed onto a dock for TV, then you take it out as a handheld console, using the same charger that would plug in to the dock, but onto the actual console itself. This was very great in comparison to the Wii U, because with the Wii U gamepad, you couldn't play too far from the console. Now you can just take the handheld part off that plugs into the TV, and you can play it anywhere. the Xbox would release the successors known as the Xbox One X and later the Xbox Series S, X, and Series S. And other than the PlayStation 4 Pro, Sony would release the PlayStation 5 in 2020. With their new consoles, both Sony and Microsoft would have their sights set on virtual reality gaming, which has become a big thing in recent years. Originally, Nintendo tried this with the Virtual Boy back in the 1990s, but there were a lot of problems, including the fact that playing that for long, due to the graphics and the red color and all that on the video games, would cause side effects, if you played too long, of course. There are a lot of improvements with the new VR headsets, including better graphics and gameplay. The Nintendo Switch would end up becoming the console with the most units sold, just like the Nintendo Wii. Nintendo would once again bounce back against the competitors. And to this day, the Switch is still successful, even going as far as to being behind the PlayStation 2 in most units sold for a video game console ever. Before I move on to playing some of the video game consoles I have, I thought I'd talk about some examples of many licensed games, as well as games from Activision. You remember when I talked about Activision earlier in this video, right? Activision in recent years was even known for the Call of Duty series, which is basically a shooter game where you play as a soldier in World War II, or you play with your friends to shoot each other and win. Or you can also play as yourself, playing in different stages like Nazi zombies and other stuff like that, which was also a thing in Black Ops 2, not just Black Ops and Black Ops 2, not just Call of Duty World at War. That's just one example I can think of a game from Activision. There are also many other licensed games based on anime and cartoons. Many of the licensed games included games from Nickelodeon and Cartoon Network on certain consoles, such as Punch Time Explosion, and as well as games from the classic and new cartoons. There are even games from Nickelodeon shows like SpongeBob, Jimmy Neutron, The Fairly Odd Parents, and also there are even some licensed games that weren't very good, including games from live action shows. And there were also a lot of licensed games from the Dragon Ball or Dragon Ball Z series. Many of the Dragon Ball games are actually very popular. They're actually very good. And I've seen some people play those games. I just never got to have the time to play the Dragon Ball related games because I don't have the Dragon Ball related games. But with every one of these new games come out, the gameplay only gets better. The graphics get better with high definition. But for the most part, it will not only be challenging, but it can also be, the game gets better to play as the new games come out. And yeah, I already mentioned Pokemon as well as Mario, and those games are still popular to this very day. But what are my opinions on some of these games? Well, I actually like a lot of these games. I like Pokemon, at least the classic ones. I like many of the Mario games. I've also played Call of Duty. I think it's alright, but I've only had the Call of Duty World at War game, as well as many other of the games that are arcade like Pac-Man, Galaga. I've also played those. At least most of these games I've mentioned I either have played or some of them are good, but I didn't mention any of the bad games. That would be a whole lot. That would be a whole nother can of worms to attack if I went over some of the bad games or games I'm just not able to beat that I have played before. However, I will still be able to play and demonstrate some of the consoles I have in this video, other than what you've already seen from other people that have played the older consoles I don't have. Now let's just try some of these consoles in this video, instead of just talking about what I've already talked about, other than how successful some of the consoles are. Let's probably try us now playing some of the games I have. So we'll do just that.
Alright, we're going to play Super Mario Bros. For a little bit on this NES Classic that I have, so I don't have the original Nintendo. So I'm going to hook this up through HDMI and we're going to get started.
I'm going to play a little bit of this. play a couple to a few more of these. I made a mistake there. I'll get better. It's just I made a mistake. Bad that won't work. Good gravy. Hopefully I can reach this. Okay, this will have the timer come up. The timer goes. There we go, at least I made it. We're gonna just do the first castle stage, and that'll be about it. Thank you, Mario, Princess, and our castle. And that's where we stop it there. Anyways, that's about it for my gameplay of Super Mario. I'm sorry for making those mistakes. It just happened. I just got distracted and shit, but
We're going to move on to the next console I have in my collection, and that is the Nintendo 64. We're going to play the time trials of Mario Kart 64. So let's go do just that. Alright, we're going to try a different track since this one didn't work too well. We're going to do Luigi Raceway instead. I'm going to do a much easier one this time. Yeah, this is a much easier track. But if you thought certain tracks would be bad to do time trials or race on, well, you might be right. There's one track I hate in this game, and that's Toad's Turnpike. That one is absolute worst because you gotta race in the middle of the traffic. It's not fun at all. Not fun at all. So would I recommend doing time trials on Toad's Turnpike? Absolutely not. But if you like that track, and you actually think that track is fun, then I respect your opinion. But please respect my opinion on Toad's Turnpike, because I don't like Toad's Turnpike. That's just all I'm going to say about that. In my opinion, Toad's Turnpike is probably one of the worst tracks ever on Mario Kart 64. The worst? Yeah, I decided to pick Luigi Raceway for the second time, because this one is a whole lot easier. There we go. Anyway, that will be about all for the time trials. This is the best game I decided to pick for my Nintendo 64 right up there. I also have some other games too, which I won't be playing. I got 2 Star Wars games. I got Hey You Pikachu, which I need the accessory for that, and Glover. Anyways, that's pretty much all I got. Anyways, next one I'm going to play is this GameCube. I'm going to play some Tetris on this GameCube on the Game Boy player. I might as well do just that. And there we go. Let's start playing the Game Boy player. We're going to play some Tetris. Alright, let's do this. Let's play some Tetris, guys. I'm not gonna play any Game Boy games. I'm not gonna play any other Game Boy games. I'm just gonna play Tetris because I could play some other Game Boy Advance games. I do have Mario Kart Super Circuit. However, when I tried to play that, the game the game copy fucked up. So I'm just, one time when I did a stream of that, so I'm just not going to be able to play that game. So instead, to represent Game Boy, we're just going to pick the game that came with the Game Boy, and that's Tetris, and that's what we're going to play on this, on the Game Boy player on the GameCube. Alrighty. So far, it's pretty much the best game I'm able to play with no problem whatsoever. Including Mario Bros. 2. Mario Bros. That's also a good game too. I mean, I don't mind the game being challenging as long as it's not too hard to play. Like, you know what I mean, right? Yeah. Alrighty. Alright, this will have to be a long while, though. But yeah, this is one of the best games I know how to play, and I've done very good at Tetris before. Well, that's about it. Well, I'll put on my name. I know people like to make jokes that I build brick walls, and there you go, I build them in Tetris. Before I end this video, there are just a few games I would like to mention that I forgot to mention in this video. One of the games I would like to mention is the Grand Theft Auto series of games. Those games were very great as they made you commit crimes without facing much consequences. It's a lot of fun to do because the game is titled something that is illegal. There are, of course, other non-Nintendo games worth mentioning, such as the plethora of sports games, like Madden, for example. There are a lot of Madden American football games that come out every year. And also some other app-related games, such as Plants vs. Zombies, Fortnite, and Bejeweled, which they also had sequels too, like Plants vs. Zombies 2 and others like that. There are a whole bunch of other games I might forget, but I just thought I mentioned some of those real quick in this video so I wouldn't get people mad at me just for forgetting some of this stuff in the video. Anyways, that's about all, so let's go straight to the outro. Anyways, that was about all for my video on the origins and history of video games. As you just saw, you saw me play a few video games from certain console eras like the Game Boy, the Nintendo 64, as well as the NES from the NES Classic with Super Mario Bros. And that was about all for this video. I explained the entire history of video games from the very old consoles to showing people who've played the original consoles and even to the new generation. In fact, video games have come a long way and definitely have shaped
a lot of our culture, as well as in nostalgia per se. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this video. The next video will be a video on the old Nickelodeon, where I go over the classic Nickelodeon from the late 70s all the way to the early to mid 2000s. And yeah, if you want to see more videos like this, check out my channel. I got much other videos that are similar to this on my channel. And anyways, that'll be about all. This has been Brick Johnson from Nostalgia Network, and I'm out.